probably saw by the title, it is about two. So I'm just gonna get, after all telling you all my woes and sorrows, right into this. It was September 11th of 2017. A perfect evening for fishing, which is exactly what was happening on Lake Ontario, specifically on the Oshawa, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, pier in Oshawa, a suburb of Ontario, Canada. Oshawa, you know. One particular fisherman saw something floating on the surface of the lake, just a little way in the distance, and he was out there fishing with his 11-year-old grandson, and he thought that this would be like a teaching experience. He would teach his grandson that if you notice something like that, then you should take it upon yourself to clean up someone else's mess, thinking that this is some sort of litter or something in the lake. So the two of them cast their lines toward this object, and it took a couple attempts for them to snag it and reel it towards them, but they finally get it into their net, and they pull it up on the pier, and it is not a piece of litter. It's not a discarded item at all. It was a discarded person. They had cast out their lines and caught a human torso, a female torso, one that had very evidently been through some trauma and was incomplete with the rest of her body. Immediately calling the authorities, before long the harbor was swarming with police, news reporters, and it was clear to detectives that this body had not come from anything other than some form of a homicide. And this, they made the assumption because of the trauma around the detachment areas. And there was no way of identifying this torso except for the fact that she was human, oh for God's sakes, female, yay, human, female, human. Guys, why do you watch me? I am a mess. She did not have any identifying birthmarks, scars, or tattoos upon her torso. And for all they knew, she could have come from anywhere, as Lake Ontario spans far more than just Oshawa. In fact, the Canadian-US border runs right through the middle, with Ontario, Canada on the north side and upstate New York on the south side, so she could have come from anywhere. So while they wait for the DNA test results to come from the lab, their first port of call was to check the missing persons database. Maybe something could start their investigation, and a name did pop up. But until the labs came back, they could only form a tentative list of maybes and wait. And wait is what they did, because it took 2 months for their lab to get to this sample. And the wait was worth it though, because once the results did come back, investigators had a name. Their Jane Doe was an 18-year-old woman by the name of Rori Hache, one of the names that they had written on their maybe list. A girl who had been reported missing 2 months prior to the torso being person's case is a homicide case. And for Rory's family, this was absolutely devastating news. It meant that any glimmer of hope that they had that she would come back to them was ripped away. And they had so many questions. How had she ended up in the lake? Why were her body parts not all together? Who had done this? Why had they done it? And where is the rest of Rory? So, with no immediate clues and no witnesses as of yet, police start to try to piece together Rory's final days. Who was she, and why had her life been cut short? Rory was born in July of 1999. She had grown up in Oshawa. When she was young, she loved animals and surprisingly preferred the company of the elderly, maybe more than people of her own age. By the age of 13, she had earned the title of Army Cadet of the Year twice, and she was known as bright and full of energy. But there was one chink in what otherwise should have been basically an idyllic childhood. Her upbringing was described in a lot of articles I read as complicated. First, her grandfather, a man named Bernie, was known locally as Bernie the Frog. He was the founder of a biker organization called, I'm gonna say this differently than what it should be, but Santa. It's the same letters, you just gotta mix them up. Choice Motorcycle Club. And in fact, at one point, this was the second largest outlaw biker group, not just in Canada, but in the world. And these were pretty stereotypical outlaw biker clubs. I'm not trying to compartmentalize and say if you're a biker, you're an outlaw, but just stick with me. So, Rory's grandfather alone had convictions for distribution and possession, assault, and he had actually been incarcerated at one point for 22 years. Bernie the Frog, though, managed to find the time to father somewhere between 11 and 16 kids. Couldn't find an exact number. All the articles were different. I don't know. It's still a lot. And the exact number is disputed. However, one of these kiddos was Rory's uncle. Another interesting fellow. Not so ironically, this uncle's name was Harley Davidson. And his last name is Gideon, which is Bernie's last name too. And he was, I don't even know if I can say this on YouTube, an HELLS, angel biker, along with his own string of offenses to his name, mainly all for illegal and illicit substances. But out of all of her aunts and uncles, however many there actually were, it was Harley who Rory was the closest to. And Rory was a sweet kid. She was fiercely loyal to her friends and super intelligent. And up until high school, she always told people that she was going to be a veterinarian when she grew up because she loved animals so much. Except when she got to high school, her life veered off track. She was 14 when someone offered her an illicit substance for the first time. She accepted and tragically found herself in a 4-year-long battle with addiction. Her mom, whose name is Shannon, was desperate to help her daughter places that nobody of her age should be. And at one point when she was 17, she moved out from her mother and went to live with her uncle Harley and his family. And considering he was on house arrest at the time for illicit substances, it wasn't exactly the kind of place that somebody struggling with addiction should be. But according to Rory's mom and grandmother, the 6 months before Rory was reported missing, she seemed to have turned her life around. She was making big changes for the better, it seemed. She'd gotten a steady boyfriend, a good guy. His name was Tony. She had enrolled back in high school, and she had gotten a job, and she was making enough money that she was able to rent her own apartment. The difference in Rory was huge. And then in August of that year, so 2017, the month before she disappeared, she dropped this huge bombshell on her family. She was pregnant with Tony's baby. And her family was kind of worried that this would set Rory off track. And they were kind of relieved, in fact, when they realized that she was over the moon about becoming a mom and even more determined to stay on the better, cleaner path for her baby. However, a couple of weeks after the announcement, something happened that kind of derailed Rory, and y'all have been with me recently and you know, so I sympathize. But Rory's childhood dog was killed in a fire that broke out in her mom Shannon's house. Shannon herself was injured, but nothing life-threatening. But the death of this beloved animal made Rory go off the rails. And she relapsed, and she kind of went kind of MIA with her family. She was a frequent flyer at a youth center called The Refuge, and they immediately noticed changes in Rory's behavior. She had gone back to being secretive and lying and just different. Her uncle Harley also noticed the difference in Rory, and when he tried to talk about it with her, she clammed up and wouldn't speak of it. One of the last times that Harley had seen Rory, and as she said goodbye to him, he would later say that their hug had been different. It had given him the weirdest feeling, like a permanent goodbye hug, not just a I'll see you later kind of hug, which gave me the feels. So people at the refuge would state that the last time they saw Rory was August 27th. However, supposedly she was still alive and well 3 days later, as a friend came forward and said they had taken Rory to Oshawa's Lake Ridge Hospital on late August 29th, early hours of August 30th. Now, the reasons why are kind of murky, but it seems like it was due to a mental episode. When investigators checked the CCTV footage for this, though, they saw that 15 minutes after being dropped off, Rory left again, alone. She was never seen by a doctor, and that CCTV footage is the last known sighting of Rory Hache. She wasn't seen again until her torso washed up 12 days later. But again, they wouldn't know that it was Rory until November. So in those first few days after being dropped off at the hospital by her friend and not being seen since, her friends and family get more and more worried when no one can reach her. They report her missing to the police, they post on Facebook, they make flyers which they distributed locally, but no one had seen her. And even just refused to believe it. So when the police called them with the news that the torso had matched Rory's DNA, it was really bittersweet for them. They had been right. She hadn't run away. But the reality of facing that meant they had to face the reality that someone had not only harmed her, but harmed her in a brutal way. Which brings me right back to what I was asking before. How did she end up in the lake? Who did this? Why did they do it? And where is the rest of Rory? 6 weeks later, the answers would start trickling in. Investigators had theorized during those 6 weeks that the perpetrator could be a hunter or have experience in the medical profession. Rory's dismemberment had been too clean and methodical for them not to be. But even with that hunch and their efforts, no significant leads or answers emerged until December 28th. And it comes kind of weirdly. A 911 call is received from a man named Shannon. He was a local plumber who had been called out to an apartment building in Oshawa. The upstairs tenants had been complaining that their plumbing wasn't working properly and that their sinks and bathtub were getting backed up. And it had reached a point that the smell was unbearable. The tenant in the basement had told them that he would try to fix it, and that he thought that it was something that he had put down the drain that had inflated and gotten stuck. A form of protection. I don't know, YouTube's so picky. But they decided that without this man's knowledge, they were just going to call in some professionals because they kept waiting and waiting for him to fix it, and he just didn't do it. So this is how this Sean guy found himself there on that December day. But he had no idea what he was about to get himself into. The basement apartment had been lived in for the last 10 years by a 45-year-old man named Adam Strong. After speaking with the upstairs neighbors, Sean figured out that the blockage had from Adam's apartment. So he knocked on Adam's door, and almost immediately he answered, and the most nauseating smell smacked Sean and his colleague right in the face. Now Adam reluctantly let them into his apartment, and Sean and his colleague started to do whatever it is that plumbers do. And they're looking for the cause of this blockage, yeah. And they find it. During his 911 call, Sean explains to the dispatcher that he had pulled around 10 to 15. Wait, hold on, here's your trigger warning, okay, because this is where it gets yucky. He had pulled around 10 to 15 pounds of flesh from the pipes. And as he kept pulling, he became more and more convinced that this is human, especially when parts started to have visible hair on them. And really, I'm kind of guessing he called 911 on the sly because there's really not any mention of Adam's reaction to this plumber Sean guy calling 911, but he suddenly finds the police banging on his door, and the first words out of his mouth when the officers are standing there when he opens the door is, "The jig's up. It's a body." What? Okay, so this guy was... Anyway, so they immediately arrest him, and Adam's is not finished yet. He says, if you want the rest of her, she's in the freezer. Turns out, he wasn't lying. As officers open the freezer, they are greeted by what I can only imagine is the most gruesome, devastating sight. Various body parts, including a human head. And they immediately knew that this belonged to Rory because they saw a tattoo of the word alive on the neck. And Rory had the same tattoo in the same place. Can you even? I'm not even done with the trigger warnings yet, y'all. So they got this man in the back of the police car, and officers are searching the apartment initially, alongside the smell of human decomposition. This place is a friggin' mess. Among the clutter, they find some pretty interesting stuff. Restraining devices, weapons, one of which was a hammer, which they would later say had Rory's DNA on it. They also find a pair of female running shoes in a plastic bag with very evident blood splatter on them, later found to be Rory's. And the shoes were confirmed as belonging to her. So they're making their way to his bedroom, and they notice more blood on the walls and the baseboards leading to it. So Adam suddenly decides he can't talk anymore, and they decide they have to dig deeper, of course. What on earth is this 45-year-old man's connection to 18-year-old pregnant Rory? Rory's family had never heard of him. So why is she in this man's freezer? So the first thing they do is look at his online presence, both his social media and his search history. And they find out that his Facebook is quite the interesting read. One of his most recent posts says, "Why is it so hard to find a woman who is honest, loyal, trusting, and willing to accept the freak that I am?" There were then pictures of him holding weapons and other pictures of cuffs and a caption, "Home is where my handcuffs hang." Through his social media, they were able to track down an ex-girlfriend of Adam's, and she said that he was obsessed with certain websites that I didn't even know existed that contain videos of car accidents and murder and I can't even. So he, according to her, liked small petite girls that he could control. She said that as their relationship continued, things between them got so rough that she got scared, and he would never take no for an answer. So he definitely seemed like the type that wanted to prey on females who were vulnerable, homeless, struggling, and Rory definitely checkmarked that box. After the breakup with the girl that spoke to the police, he said, "I think I'm going to up my standards from my last girlfriend." On Facebook he says this. "My next girlfriend is going to be required to have nice teeth." And he mentions a body part and a job. This ex-girlfriend's account of him being obsessed with these websites kind of tracked when they get into his search history. But before I get into all that, let me jump back a little. They found Rory's shoes, blood spatter, and the hammer. But there was another weapon that piqued their interest. They found a specialty Wyoming knife in the kitchen drawer, and it is a pretty popular instrument for hunters, and it definitely could have been used on Rory. Despite finding it in the kitchen drawer, it was not clean, and there was stuff on it, and they believed that this would be human tissue. Now hold on, we're gonna come back to that, but there was another random discovery that they made. To the shock of the neighbors, they now found eye or something. And it only gets crazier. The labs come back with an even more horrific discovery. The stuff that was on the knife did not match Rory. Now, obviously, Adam has been arrested, and throughout his 3-hour interrogation, he refuses to say anything. And at the end of the interview, he's arrested on the charge of interference with a dead body. And that's how things stayed until the lab results came back on the knife, saying that the tissue wasn't a match to Rory, which is July 10th of 2018. Yes, 6.5 months later. Yeah, you heard me. So the police hold a press conference informing the media that, tragically, there is a second victim in this case. DNA testing had confirmed that the remains on the knife belonged to a 19-year-old girl named Kandis Fitzpatrick, who had gone missing from the area 10 years prior. You haven't cleaned your knife in 10 years, homie. For real. The similarities between her and Rory's lives were similar. Too similar to ignore. Not only had they been similar ages, they had both had periods of homelessness, and they both struggled with addiction. Kandis had disappeared in March of 2008, and her family had been searching ever since, right up until the results came back in July of 2018. Sadly, it is alleged by her dad that he tried to report Kandis missing dozens of times, but because of the instability of her living arrangements and her illicit substance use, police kind of only ever half-heartedly took down the actual details. And the minute that her dad said that she would often take off for weeks without coming home, they just stopped listening. We've talked about enough cases to know. They ignored the part where he said no matter what, she would always check in to say that she was okay. And this makes me so mad, you guys, because we know that the first 24 hours are imperative. And I hate that, when you're dealing with loved ones, if they mention that you have suffered with addiction or are a certain kind of worker, then there's only so far that the police will go to try to help you. Like, they figure you're not worth the resources, and it just makes me so angry. Anyway, Kandis's disappearance largely went ignored, but she will get justice. First, though, the detectives were trying to figure out what the connection was. With 10 years apart in age and 10 years apart in their deaths, there's no link. So how had both of them managed to come upon Adam Strong? So police could only assume that it was because they traded themselves for favors. But Rory's family, they were getting pretty irritated in those 6 months waiting for those results, and with the lack of movement. And I feel like, I don't know why the results take so long, but in November of 2018, over a year after Rory's torso had been found, and 11 months after Adam's initial arrest, investigators once again questioned him. And where he had not felt like talking 11 months ago, he sang kind of like a little birdie almost. He measured his answers because he didn't want to give detectives any cause to actually charge him, to up his charge from tampering with a body to outright murder. But he underestimated these investigators. He figured that as long as he stuck to the practicalities as to what he'd done to Rory, then he would be safe from the charges. But the reality was that the more details he revealed, the more they could piece together his actions, because he's not as smart as he thinks he is. He told them that he knew Rory because she was sleeping his apartment every now and then. He had no idea what happened to her or how it happened to her. And this is when they hit him with these DNA results from the knife found in his kitchen. And at this point, he realizes that he can't deny at least having tampered with Kandis's body. And he says, "I'm a real bad procrastinator, and that is a detriment to myself. I definitely effed myself over." Really, dude? Wow, really? So after 12 hours of interrogation, where Adam remains calm and cooperative, detectives feel like they have enough to change his charges, in Rory's case, to murder, and to add Kandis's murder charge. At his arraignment the next day, when he was asked by the judge why he looked so disheveled, he said it was because he had been awake all night worrying. Give me a break, dude. He pled not guilty, and a trial was set for September 28th of 2020. So, with the trial now pending, the prosecution has got to get all of their ducks in a row. They have a confession to tampering with the girls, but not to killing them. So they start to build this profile of this 45-year-old man to see if they could add some weight to their theory. Other than his job as a sometime security guard and working at a gas station, not a lot is known about Adam, his past or present life. The only thing that they had were the ex-girlfriends, and investigators had spoken to them way back when the plumbers had made the original discovery. So, with not a lot to add, they're nervous that Adam might get away with this. And then he decides to throw them another curveball. He decides to waive his right to a jury trial and have a judge-only trial. And there are pros and cons to each option. Some people think it's safer for a defendant to choose a judge-only trial, as any complexities or things that might be ambiguous to a normal citizen, as opposed to a legal expert, could mean that the verdict is more in their favor. So for whatever reason, this is what Adam chose, and of course in 2020, we're right in the thick of the pandemic, so for the handful of times that they were physically in the courtroom, as opposed to being on a video, hardly anyone was allowed to attend. The few family members that did obviously had to sit apart, and to Rory and Kandis's families, I'm sure that this just heightened their fear of what Adam's fate would be. And Adam didn't make it easy. More often than not, the trial was taking place over video, and this fool just decided that he would appear when he wanted to, and not when he didn't. And the prosecution is determined not to let this man win, and frankly, he's not endearing himself to the judge by not showing up when he's supposed to. It's not a choice. So they outlined how Rory's remain had been found in the pipes of Adam's apartment, how he told his neighbors not to call the plumbers, and then they explained to the judge how, calm and cool and collected he had been when he answered the door to the cops and just nonchalantly confessed that the rest of Rory was in the freezer. This led the prosecutor to highlight the injuries found on Rory's remains, coupled with the blood spatter evidence they found around his house, which basically painted a horrifying picture of Rory's final moments. She wasn't just some random body that he brought into his house. Equally damning was the testimony from his two former girlfriends. They testified that he was heavily into rough acts, which was consensual for one of them, but not the other. And the one that said in her testimony that she was terrified in these encounters that she would die. So it's increasingly obvious that he had a pattern of aggressive behavior that could lend itself to murder. Kandis, they believe, most likely died the same way, bludgeoned or strangled to death and disposed of. But sadly, even after telling Adam the discovery and saw just how cold Adam was. He heard the part where investigators had asked him how he had dumped Rory's torso in the river, and he refused to even acknowledge the fact that he had. And when investigators were like, look, your phone records put you at the lake on September 4th, a week before the grandfather and grandson found them, the judge hears him nonchalantly say, well, there you go then. And there's another part of the interrogation that had no doubt did not endear him to this judge. Just after they had told him that they had found Kandis's knife, DNA on the knife, and he again blames his procrastination, he says what he should have done, saying he should have boiled the knife there and then, but he kept putting it off for 10 years, bro. He said that he eventually forgot all about it, and it was the same with Rory. He looked at her in the freezer daily and told himself that he needed to finish, but he would do it tomorrow, and instead it was months later before he got to it. You a creep, dude, you a creep. According to him, of course he has a reason. This all stems from his horrible upbringing. Not only was he not loved by his parents, but he was also assaulted by a babysitter when he was young. And that is why he lives this unorthodox lifestyle. No, we're not. No. The prosecution was essentially about to seal Adam's fate, though, with a star witness and the pathologist's findings. They called to the stand a man named Paul Parker, a taxi driver who would frequent the gas station where Adam worked the night shift. The two of them had struck up kind of a friendship, and according to his testimony, Paul explained that on one occasion he had teased Adam about the fact that he didn't have or couldn't get a girlfriend, and Adam allegedly had gotten super mad. He grabbed his phone and he showed Paul a video of a woman with a blindfold over her eyes, and she was tied to a door frame in what looked like Adam's apartment. Adam is also in the video with the woman, and what struck Paul is how young this girl looks. And they very likely believe this video could have been Rory. Paul also testified that Adam had shown him those websites that he was fascinated with. Then it was the pathologist's turn to address the judge, and after conducting the post-mortem on Rory's remains, Andrew Williams explained that he had not been able to find a definitive cause of death, mainly due to the fact that she was already apart and floating in the lake. Ugh. But police had never been able to find Rory's internal organs. He did say that he had her skull, well, her head. When he'd examined it, he found 2 fractures, both consistent with blunt force trauma to the skull. She also had visible bruising on her chin, both cheeks, and around her right eye, which, due to the color and pattern, were all consistent with having occurred before she passed away. And with that, the trial's over. The judge announced he would go over the evidence and have his verdict within the next couple of weeks. The date for Adam's verdict kept being pushed back because of the pandemic, and it wasn't until March 16th of 2021 that they would be put out of their misery. After summarizing all of the evidence and the horrific details, the judge was ready to decide Adam's fate. He began by saying that he was very satisfied that the prosecution had successfully proven that Rory had died at the hands of Adam, likely somewhere between September 1st and September 3rd. Not only were his neighbors upstairs away, but his comings and goings with the remains would likely go unnoticed, but his phone data showed him at the creek on September 1st, where Rory had been sleeping rough. years. Unusual for him compared to the rest of his previous data. And then suddenly on September 4th, his phone shows him traveling to Lake Ontario, where he likely disposed of Rory's torso. Now, despite the lack of admission from Adam, the judge said that it was his belief that Rory had passed away in the bedroom of the apartment, where the blood spatter evidence had been found due to blunt force trauma. And the fact that she had bruises and facial fractures indicated that there had been a violent altercation between them. And with that, on the charge of first-degree murder of Rory, he found Adam Strong guilty. So, what about Kandis Fitzpatrick? Well, again, the judge said he was satisfied. I have to take a drink, guys. I'm sorry. Oh, goodness. Stay. Okay, hold on. Sorry about that. So the judge was satisfied that the prosecution had proven that she too had died at the hands of Adam Strong, specifically due to the weapon found in his kitchen. As welcome as that was for a family to hear, I think that there was also an element of surprise, because not only had he not confessed to hurting her, but her remains hadn't been found either. Interestingly, though, the judge, to a degree, did acknowledge that and justified his decision. He said that although they didn't know how she died, it was clear to him from the many statements made by Adam that Kandis had met with the same fate as Rory. He gave the example of when, during the 12-hour interview, Adam had been surprised to find out that Rory's torso had floated to the surface, despite the fact that he had removed her internal organs. And what in the world would make him think that it wouldn't? Like, I don't... So, if he'd done the same thing before, that might be the case. Had he successfully thrown Kandis's torso in the lake? Well, the judge seemed to think yes. However, although he was finding Adam guilty of Kandis's death, because they didn't have a body or evidence, the prosecution had not satisfied the requirements for murder, so he was found guilty on the lesser charge of manslaughter. In the judge's closing statement, he looked at Adam and he said, "You are a dangerous predator who will never be seen in public again." And then he handed down a life sentence for first-degree murder of Rory Hache and an 18-year sentence for the manslaughter of Kandis Fitzpatrick, both sentences to run concurrently. And as you can imagine, both families were filled with relief that their daughters had received justice. Although, for Kandis's family, the closure wasn't quite there, as much as, because she had never been recovered. But I imagine even with finding her DNA, you still have hope that she's alive and out there somewhere. However, in about the only semi-decent thing that Adam did at all, he finally decides to give Kandis's family the closure they deserve, and he confessed to a prison guard where she was located. In November of 2021, police escort him to an area of Oshawa that he claimed to have buried her. And the most shocking part of all of that was she was 30 feet from his apartment. And super frustratingly, because he'd already been convicted, they could not up the charges from manslaughter to murder. However, he won't see the light of day until 2042, where at that point he will be 70 years old. To this day, Adam has never said how he met either of these women or why he had harmed them. And then there's this 10-year gap between them, and it kind of makes me wonder if he was a patient predator or if there were other victims in those 10 years. possibly due to addiction or homelessness, who haven't been reported missing by their loved ones, or he didn't admit to anything, and so they've never tied him to their cases. But this case is about remembering the two young women with their whole lives ahead of them. One of them about to bring another new life in the world. If it had not been for a cold, calculating, and unassuming predator. So I know this one was a little bit heavier than we have done in a while, but I felt like it needed to be told. YouTube is probably gonna demonetize me for it. I just got a text message. I don't even know what for. Okay. What? What? Oh, for God's sakes. Okay, whatever. Some people are so strange. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about this. This guy is one of the most wackadoo, creepy, I can't even, with this case, like, what in the world? The more that I learned, the more that I was icked out by this case, and I don't understand why Rory was quote-unquote sleeping rough, and how this man convinced her to come inside. Why was she not, with Tony? Why was she not at her uncle's house? Why was she out there? I mean, I understand maybe she was trying to score her next fix or something, but it just doesn't make sense to me. And I have to believe that he probably abducted her somehow. I mean, she was little and then harmed her, and I have to think that it was motivated by his rough wants and actions. He couldn't find someone willing to do it, so he had to find someone that he could force to do it, and that makes me so sick. It makes me sick to think that there are still people out there today doing these kinds of things to people, and I can't. But I definitely think that this guy had more victims, and I think that had Rory's torso not floated to the surface of the lake, he would have continued to harm people for goodness knows how long. And I hope that he never gets out, and I hope that he is having an absolutely terrible time in prison, wherever he is, because I'm just one of those people that sometimes, in some cases, I'm like, okay, well, let's strangle this guy and take him apart and throw him in a lake and see how he feels. Like, I mean, obviously he's not gonna be able to tell me how he feels after that, but geez, man, like, the withdrawal to actually do that to someone, I can't even, I can't. It didn't really explain whether he was a hunter. Clearly wasn't someone of the medical, but I'm of a medical, and I couldn't do that. watching. Again, I'm so sorry that this video is a week late. I have a video filmed by Sean to upload, and I just haven't done it. I have extra content started,